Hi, folks. This is Abel James, and thanks so much for listening to the Fat Burning Man Show, where we talk about real food and real results. I'm very blessed to be here today with a guest who has been requested from all over the world. I've seen him speak a few times. It's a knowledge-packed show full of wisdom and very entertaining as well. It's Mr. Joel Salatin, and he's a self-described Christian, libertarian, environmentalist, capitalist, lunatic farmer who produces high-quality, beyond organic meats, which are raised using environmentally responsible, ecologically beneficial, and sustainable agriculture. Before we get to the show, I wanted to let you guys know about a really cool project that we have coming up the next few weeks. It's called the Fat Burning Chef, and basically we went out to all of our friends, some of the top bloggers and authors in the cooking space, in the paleosphere and beyond, and asked if they'd contribute to helping us build a book of very healthy recipes that are also magnificent to look at and taste great. So that's coming out in the next few weeks. It's called The Fat Burning Chef. Stay tuned. We're really excited about it. If you'd like to hear more and stay up to date, you can follow me on Facebook, which is facebook.com/fatburningman. But the best way to find us is just to head on over to fatburningman.com and put your best email address in the opt-in box, and we'll keep you up to date with everything that's coming out. The new shows, send you free ebooks, as well as stuff coming out like the Fat Burning Chef. Really excited about it. All right, so on to the show with Mr. Joel Salatin. We talk about, and biting my tongue a little bit here, any of you vegans out there might want to put on your earmuffs, but we talk about some problems with the vegan diet, whether or not beyond organic farming practices are scalable on a worldwide scale, why American food policy is favorable to products that make us fat and sick, and why there is poop in your chicken nuggets. All right, on to the show with Joel. All right, folks, today I'm very excited to be here with Mr. Joel Salatin, who's a third-generation beyond organic farmer whose family owns and operates Polyface Farm in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. Author of 7 books and featured in National Geographic, Smithsonian, Omnivore's Dilemma, Food Inc., and more, he's focused on healing the earth with good food. How are you, Joel?
I'm doing well, Abel. I hope you are.
I am. So tell us about what you're working on. I remember I just mentioned before this call that I saw you speak at Harvard at AHS last year. Really enjoyed your talk, but can you give a basic rundown of the way you do things on your farm?
Well, sure. We're in the pastured livestock business. And if you realize that almost all animals now are produced in confinement factory-type houses with grain, with no exercise, no pasture, no fresh air, no sunshine, you realize how revolutionary when you say pastured livestock is. So we raise salad bar beef, where we mimic, the way herbivores have always run on the prairie, by moving them every day to a fresh paddock, like they get moved with, lions and tigers and things like that,
right?
And wolves. Then we raise pigerator. We call it pigerator pork, where we allow the pigs to actually, move and root and dig, and build our compost as aerators. Hence, pig aerators.
I love it.
And then we raise poultry of several stripes. We raise, of course, broilers, chickens, in pastured, portable pasture pens. Shelters that we move every day on the pasture. They're floorless, so the birds are actually, they're actually out on the ground, but protected with this shelter over them. Raise eggs with pastured layers that in a couple of different models. The most famous probably being the egg mobiles, which follow the cows in their rotation. So the birds follow the herbivores, and the birds scratch through the cow patties and eat out the fly larvae and the pathogens and the bugs, and and eat the grasshoppers and crickets that are now exposed because the cows have grazed the grass down, and convert all that sanitation into eggs. We also raise turkeys, again on pasture in high-tech electric netting with portable shelters that we move around, and the turkeys, of course, will pick up a lot off the pasture. And then we also have forage-based rabbits in portable shelters that move along on the grass. The rabbits will pick up about 75% of their diet off of the grass. So this is all about, one of the most fundamental things that we see in animals in nature is A, they move, and B, they're on pasture. Those are two, it's profound that modern American industrial agriculture does not believe either one of those things is important, animals moving or pasture.
Yeah. Oh, and it's so bizarre. I remember I was at my brother's organic farm a few months back, and I saw what they had to do to move the chickens around in the same way that you describe. I think he took a page out of your book there, and he built a chicken coop on the back of a trailer, and
Hmm.
so they had to pack it up and move it around constantly. It's a heck of a lot of work. But I was just on your website, and I loved this quote that describes the difference between industrialized food and non-industrialized food. Someone said, "These eggs just jump up and slap you in the face." I love that. So, can you talk a little bit about that? How is this food that comes as a product of your system different than the traditional system that you find in America anyway?
Well, I think there are a couple of really, I mean, there are a lot of differences, but if we could look at really fundamental differences, one is that they're much higher in mineral and vitamin content. We all know that grains are high in energy and low in vitamin mineral content. If you
Hmm.
want vitamin mineral content, you don't eat bread. You eat, carrots and spinach and things like that. It's the salad bar. It's the green material, the carotenes that are so high in vitamins and minerals. So when you have a pasture-based livestock situation, all of the meat and the eggs and the poultry are going to be highly colored, i.e. the fat won't be white. It will
Hmm.
have a yellowish tint, which indicates the carotenes and the vitamin mineral content. The color is good. Color is good in roses, and it's also good, for example, in pork. When the industry says pork the other white meat, that really indicates an anemic, slovenly, tasteless, junk meat.
Yeah.
And really good pork should have a rose color. It should have an iron-rich, deep color to it.
Hmm.
So the vitamin mineral content is one thing. The second big difference is in the fat, the fatty acid profile. As you know, our brains are primarily fat.
Hmm.
And so this is one of the big problems with a vegan diet is that your brain atrophies. You actually can't think very well because you're not getting the essential fatty acids, that build brain tissue. That that has interesting ramifications, But
Yeah.
um,
No
but
comment.
but the fact is that the essential fatty acids are important for brain development, all sorts of things.
Hmm.
And so when you green material meat, poultry, and eggs, what you have is a polyunsaturated tendency rather than a saturated fat tendency. And I don't want to, get off in a big debate about saturated fats and all that, but you can measure this very easily. Like, when you take off chicken broth
Hmm.
and the fat rises to the top and is real hard like paraffin. Our chicken fat, for example, when it rises to the top and you have the broth underneath, it stays very soft like vegetable shortening.
Hmm.
So this is indicative of a very different kind of fat. And then I would say, one of the third big nutritional or big differences that we see, that it's much different in density. Because our animals exercise and they're highly oxygenated, the actual amount of nutrition per cubic or nutrition per pound actually goes up, and the pounds per cubic measure go up. We've actually had chefs do, specific gravity tests or density tests where they'll put, 5 pounds of our pork in a water and measure the displacement,
Hmm.
5 pounds of the industrial pork, in a measuring device and measure the displacement. And we actually have measurably heavier pork per cubic foot
Wow.
or per cubic inch than the industry, and it's because the pigs are they have muscle tone.
Yeah.
They're moving around. They got places to go, appointments to keep, and relationships to build.
No, that's a good point. It seems like it's getting quite a bit easier to find grass-fed beef in various even supermarkets around the country, which is promising in terms of a trend. But when you look at pork, it seems like that's lagging behind. It's very difficult to find high-quality pork that was raised the way that nature intended. Why is that?
Well, I think for a couple of reasons. One is that the pork industry has followed the poultry industry in vertical integration.
Yeah.
The big companies. And so, for example, in Virginia, which is a perfect example of this, we now have 3 times as many hogs in Virginia as we did 40 years ago,
Wow.
and we have 90% fewer farms with hogs on them. So,
Really?
if that doesn't speak to the centralization and the factoryization, I don't know, factoryization is not a word, I'm sure, but
It is now.
it speaks to that, centralization of the industry. Whereas in the beef industry, the average herd of beef cows in this country is still only about 30 or 40 head.
Mm-hmm.
That's what one bull can impregnate. So beef is still the least centralized. It's a very, decentralized, spread out kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
and much more free market, if you will, than pork and poultry. So whenever you have consolidation and amalgamation in an industry, you have far less innovation than you do in an industry that is far more, decentralized and democratized on its face.
Right. That brings up an interesting point too. It seems that the methods that you incorporate into your farming practice, while they're innovative, they're also very much closer to the way that things used to be. But at the same time, you're called a lunatic for doing a lot of these things. Can you comment on that a little bit? Why is this considered crazy these days?
Well, it's considered crazy for a number of reasons. Yeah, I mean, and of course, my calling myself a lunatic is just my way of laughing at the absurdity of the industry's labeling of us as bioterrorists.
Yeah.
Because, for example, our chickens go out and can actually rub beaks with red-winged blackbirds, indigo buntings, and cardinals.
Mm-hmm.
And the industry believes that kind of interaction between domestic and wild animals will spread, diseases to the, domestic livestock, especially the confinement, like Tyson chicken houses, and bring disease and threaten the planet's food supply. I mean, they actually think that, I'm part of, playing Russian roulette with the world's, human population,
Mm-hmm.
Because we are allowing this interaction with wildlife. That's a fundamental paradigm difference. Our belief is that there can be a symbiotic relationship between wildlife and domestic production,
Mm-hmm.
and we should figure out ways in domestic production to not have a segregated system, but have an integrated system, so that wildlife is encouraged by what we do, and of course the domestic immunity is encouraged by what we do. So the industry thinks that we are lunatics, for example, for not vaccinating and using, medications on every sick animal.
Mm-hmm.
We view sickness and disease as kind of the canary in the mine that tells us, oh, we've made a management decision. We've messed up here. And so for example, for us, when an animal gets sick, we don't immediately assume, oh, apparently that chicken was pharmaceutically disadvantaged.
Yeah.
We need to reach for a different bottle. We view that as symptomatic of something that we're doing wrong.
Yeah.
And we're responsible for creating an immunological terrain that makes, better and better immunological function. So, these are just really, really fundamental differences between, and I wrote a whole book, the sheer ecstasy of being a lunatic farmer. And, I could go on and on, but I won't, bore you with more details. But essentially, if what we did became widely adopted, it would completely invert the power, position, prestige, and profits of the entire food and farming system.
Yeah. And right now, it certainly does not seem sustainable. And certain people argue that your system is not sustainable on a large scale either. I'd love to hear you just kind of go on a rampage about that. I certainly have my own opinions.
Okay. Well, sure. That's one of the most common, the two most common questions that I get asked everywhere in the world are, number one, this is all nice and warm and fuzzy and sounds cute, but can it really feed the world? That's number one.
Mm-hmm.
And number two is, so aren't you really an elitist, because your price is higher than the Walmart cash register price?
Sure.
And so let's deal with that first one, because, yeah, absolutely, I'm in agreement. If this can't feed the world, then what are we doing here? So a couple of things. One is half of the human edible food in the world is never eaten by humans. We have that much spoilage. We have more human edible food being thrown away today than ever in the history of humankind. And the reason for that, well, there are a number of reasons, but one is that the food is not produced close to where it's consumed.
Yeah.
And so there's a tremendous amount of spoilage. We have an extremely sophisticated, finicky consumer, so that anything that's slightly blemished or too long or too short or too wide or too thin or whatever that doesn't fit the box, gets thrown out. I mean, this is one of the whole points of, Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation, talking about how the size of McDonald's French fries drives the entire potato industry. I was out in Idaho and watched a 3,000 cow dairy, feed their dairy cows tractor trailer loads of potatoes.
Jeez.
Because those potatoes were either too fat, too short, too big or too small. They didn't fit the McDonald's French fries criteria.
That is wacky.
And so this is not a production problem. This is a distribution, packaging, management. The point is there's plenty of food being produced.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two is that most of the grain in the world is going to feed herbivores, which aren't supposed to eat grain in the first place.
Right.
And so if we converted all of that grain acreage to a perennial prairie polyculture with herbivores self-harvesting and self-fertilizing, like the bison and the wolves, which built those soils in the first place, we could actually grow more volume of production than we do now. In fact, there were far more pounds of animal in North America 500 years ago than there are today, with all of our hybrids, all of our petroleum fertilizer, all of our tillage, all of our combines and harvesting techniques.
It's amazing.
So we're actually not becoming more efficient per square yard. We're simply, using more square yards, and, through drainage techniques, through irrigation techniques, we're simply using more yardage in order to, produce fairly inefficiently.
And you do that.
And finally, I would suggest that the actual production per square yard, for us, is far more than any monocrop industrial system. Anytime you start diversifying and doing multi-speciation, you ratchet up the production per acre dramatically. Even the most crude backyard garden is more productive per yard than a mega farm that makes it on the page of Successful Farming magazine.
Yeah. Now, one of the biggest differentiators between what you do and what a lot of those, kind of backyard farmers do, or small organic farms, is that you're able to do it in a profitable way. How do you make that work as a farm that does things so responsibly from an environmental perspective?
Well, first of all, think about the things we don't have to spend money on. We don't have to buy fertilizer. We don't have to buy medications. We have virtually no vet bill. Sickness and disease and fertility cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
On the average farm. And so since we don't have those costs, what we do instead is spend more money on management. We spend more money on people. While our labor costs may be higher, in aggregate, our overall costs are lower because we're not having to remediate pollution. We're not having to, to do the kinds of things that society pays for to remediate the shortcuts that industrial ag does. And so a lot of our system is creating economies of scale. We do time and motion studies. Just because we farm beyond organic does not mean that we throw out good business techniques and frugality and, time and motion studies and efficiency and all the things that, are important for any business function.
So you're still constantly innovating, it sounds like.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we've got all sorts of research projects going on. We're doing new things all the time. Some things work, some things don't. but we're constantly tweaking and refining. Yes, absolutely.
So talking about dirt under the fingernails, what are some things that you're working on now, or some things that might not have worked?
Well, some of the things that we're working on now is we are just today, actually, we planted a multi-species annual of milo, millet, cowpeas, and corn, grazing corn, sod seeded without herbicide or chemical, into an experimental pasture to see if we could get a stand and use the voluminous, productive capacity of an annual, which doesn't have to put energy in the roots like a perennial. So it actually, is able to create this great big spurt of growth, to use it as a catalyst for stimulating the biological cycle in the soil by getting our, the biomass up high enough to get our cow days of production up high enough, the grazing days of production up high enough to sheet it with manure and urine to restart the fertility cycle.
Wow.
It's on a rented farm that, where nothing's been done for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to do this as a jump start. Another experiment that we have going on is feeding some charcoal to poultry. And out at the shop right now, I just pulled in tanks today to build a charcoal maker. We've fed it to pigs routinely, but we don't make enough with our outdoor furnace to actually feed pigs all the time. Charcoal is a fabulous, a biological. What it does is if you look at it under a microscope, it has a kind of waffle appearance, and per pound has miles of surface area to colonize bacteria. And so eating and using charcoal is, there's a lot from biochar to all sorts of things written about. If you read any old farming books, Thomas Jefferson financed a lot of his, farm making charcoal. Charcoal was just a very valuable thing. And we believe, very importantly, that, we need to be recycling biomass. Our national parks and national forests are essentially becoming net carbon, exuders instead of net carbon sinks because we have this no cut, no fire policy. And so we're building up all of this rotting old, nursing home vegetation, that needs to be, culled and restarted.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's a project. We're hoping to hatch some chicks this year, and do a little bit of that. So, there are any number of projects that are ongoing that we try different things, and some of them work, some of them don't.
Yep. Sounds like you guys are busy. But now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about food safety, if you don't mind. I was reading an article that someone else had written about you with an interview recently, and you talked about how the food industry actually believes that feeding children Twinkies, Cocoa Puffs, and Mountain Dew is safe, but drinking raw milk and eating compost-grown tomatoes is dangerous. Can you offer a little bit of insight on that point?
Well, sure. You've got to understand that the obesity epidemic in our country really started in 1979 when the U.S., I call them the U.S. instead of the USDA.
Yeah.
When the USDA, created their first food pyramid. You probably remember, now we've gone through a couple of etiations since that, but that initial food pyramid, had grains on the bottom and it went on up, to the top. The problem was that broad grain carbohydrate bottom did not differentiate between, for example, a Pop-Tart and freshly ground, sprouted amaranth homemade bread.
Yeah.
And so as a result, Nabisco crackers and Oreo cookies went in as the most, fundamental part of the human diet.
Right.
And you can overlay, and believe me, I like an Oreo cookie once in a while. I'm not telling somebody that, this is, but when you don't differentiate it and you say this is the foundation of your diet without any differentiation, suddenly, you have people eating, Count Chocula and Fruit Loops for breakfast and not having, sausage and eggs or yogurt or whatever for breakfast. And so you can actually overlay the obesity, change in this country with the USDA food pyramid and dietary recommendations, and they are absolutely parallel.
Yeah.
I think it's profound. It's a profound, reality that America would be far, far healthier if the government had never told us what to eat.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. So it's almost like this food pyramid that was developed by boards of nutritionists and doctors and that sort of thing. Not only did it not make us healthy, but it kind of spurred the entire obesity epidemic.
Absolutely, because it got us away from a breakfast of sausage and eggs and bacon and berries and yogurt with berries and stuff.
Yeah.
And put us down, sent us down this path of grains, of carbohydrates.
Right.
And took us away from the protein.
Yeah. No.
On an extremely, extremely massive scale. I'm not saying that we would not have, Nabisco today were it not for the food. That's not what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have the government credentialed experts and all the power of the alphabet soup academia, experts behind a universal policy, it does move a culture. It moves a culture in a direction faster than it would if it just moved with, advertising or
mm-hmm.
a single person, making a decision, one step at a time. You have to understand that, one of the big, pushes for putting the grains on the bottom is because the U.S. ag policy is one of grain subsidy.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a tremendous amount of, the soybean council, the corn council, the wheat council. I mean, every commodity has a massive national lobby presence that, that lobbied for their thing on the top. And since, or not on the top, on the bottom,
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a massive amount of money and pressure used to manipulate the data, manipulate the research, and manipulate the politicians and the government and the bureaucracy to get in lockstep with the commodities that the Farm Bill subsidizes.
Mm-hmm.
The Farm Bill doesn't subsidize spinach and broccoli. The Farm Bill subsidizes corn, soybeans, and wheat.
Yeah.
And cotton and sugar. And
sure. So from a food policy perspective, why are we so in love with things that are so unhealthy, like sugar and grains and that sort of thing, as opposed to, say, spinach?
Yeah, well, I think that you have to go back to a context. You got to realize that grain, historically, has been very, very expensive because it requires tillage.
Mm-hmm.
It requires you to, obviously before herbicides, there was no way to kill sod, to kill pasture, to kill a perennial prairie, and plant an annual unless you killed it, and the only way to kill it was with tillage.
Mm-hmm. And
so prior to cheap petroleum fuel and mechanization, tillage was extremely laborious, from hand hoeing to, walking with a sharp stick behind an ox or a mule.
Mm-hmm.
So coming from the European, the world mindset has always been, grain is the holy grail. Grass, that's everywhere. That feeds my oxen. Basically, grass was viewed as simply a mechanism to generate energy
mm-hmm.
for draft power.
Right.
That was the energy source for the farm, for horses, mules. All those are herbivores.
Mm-hmm.
And so grass was simply a means to an end, the end being energy in the form of a horse, a mule, a cow, an oxen, or a water buffalo. A camel. All right. Anything that you could use for draft power, a llama, an alpaca. All right.
Yeah.
And so grass never achieved, iconic status in our Western culture because it was always simply an energy source to drive the Holy Grail, which was grain, which was extremely, extremely expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of natural that as the New World as was colonized and all this virgin soil, we found all this virgin soil, that the desire to reduce the cost of grain, to grow more grain, was huge. A pound of grain at that time was extremely expensive compared to a pound of beef. To us today, it sounds incongruous that you can buy a pound of grain for 30 cents and a pound of beef costs $6. But throughout history, until the last 200 years, grain was $6 and beef was 30 cents.
Yeah. Oh, that's wild.
And so now, I might be off, I can just imagine some,
Sure.
Anthropological historian, calling.
They'll show up in the comment section, but at least it's directionally accurate.
in the comments. But, forget that ratio. I mean, just imagine if grain were $1 and beef were $1.
Yeah.
Okay. It would fundamentally change. And this is why all traditional diets throughout history were founded on herbivores, dairy, beef, wild game, and seafood. Seafood. Why? Because seafood, herbivore, those two things were the nutrient-dense foods that could be grown without tillage. As soon as you moved into poultry and pork, into an omnivore, suddenly everything changed, including a diet formulated primarily around grain. You couldn't afford grain. Heavy breads. I mean, read Charles Dickens or the Three Musketeers or whatever. I mean, those heavy breads of those days were an extremely expensive component of the diet because you just couldn't carry. I mean, you had to keep the grain away from mice and rats in a day before, mesh and sheet metal and butler buildings. And so there was a tremendous cost in trying to maintain grain. I mean, much of the military wealth of ancient civilizations was guarding the great big 12-foot high clay pots in which the precious grain was stored. If you go to the Bible, for example, and you read, one of the most interesting little snippets of diet in biblical times is when King David fled, Jerusalem when his son Absalom mounted a rebellion, and he goes and visits his 80-year-old friend, and it's written in there what this friend has to eat, and it's dried fruit, lamb, kefir, warm milk, and wine. There's no mention of.
That's like a yuppie diet.
of Fruit Loops and Pop-Tarts.
Right. Wow. So let's do this. So what if a loaf of bread today were $30 and everything else were about the same? So, beef and eggs and spinach were fairly affordable, but bread was not. Why is it then historically that people would go after bread? Is it the taste, the convenience, something else?
Well, there again, some of it's cultural.
Yeah.
If something for centuries is the food of kings, who are the only ones that can afford this luxury, my goodness, if somebody can get it, if somebody can acquire it, it's like suddenly being able to get a Rolex watch. There's an allure. There's an allure, and that's why his royalty was the only one. Were the only ones that could really afford chickens routinely, or pheasants, or any kind of fowl. I mean, fowl and royalty went together. Why?
Yeah.
Because royalty was the only thing that could afford extra grain to feed those omnivores. The average peasant only had enough poultry to eat around their kitchen scraps and as a salvage operation, which meant you only, got chicken once in a while. When President Harry Truman said his vision for America was a chicken in every pot, it's because even at that recent date, chicken was still extremely expensive because it was hard to slaughter, hard to transport, hard to keep from spoiling, and grain was still relatively expensive. If he were speaking today, he would say his vision for every pot would be, filet mignon or something.
Yeah.
But at that time, the herbivore, was the peasant's meat because it could be grown without tillage.
Yeah. Oh, that is so fascinating. We're coming up on time, but I want to make sure we cover off on a few other things. You had another great quote about hubris, about how we can irradiate food today to sterilize poop rather than slowing down the processing enough so that we can actually wash it off, make sure that poop isn't in the food that we're consuming. So talking about food safety, I mean, you get a lot of criticism about that from the traditional, conventional ways of doing things today in America about your food not being safe compared to theirs, which is irradiated and full of poop. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, we have this fundamental difference of opinion that sterility equals safety, that the only way to have safe food is to sterilize it. And you know and I know that our bodies are not sterile. We actually have we're made up of 85% non-human cells. Mm-hmm. We're bacterio sapiens. We have something like 2 bacteria per human cell. I mean, it's amazing. And so we are not sterile. We are a fundamentally, bacterial being. And so traditionally, food in order to feed this bacterial community, the food has to be alive. It's not inert and sterilized. It needs to be alive. Mm-hmm. And our food safety laws today and our regulations were written primarily for the 1880s as we began to industrialize prior to understanding hygiene, bacteria, before we had stainless steel refrigeration, indoor plumbing, black plastic pipe, water heaters, and the host of hygienic and sanitation techniques that we have today. And so, it's interesting. Every time you go to some, bureaucrat who wants to, license and have, multiple food safety, gauntlets for every item of food, mm-hmm. they always go back to the 1880s, and they bring up these old pictures. They almost look like woodcuts. They're so old, and you got this guy, hand milking a cow in a, in a filthy spot in a New York ghetto, and it was out of that that the current climate was created. But today, those laws are completely outdated because we now have the ability to infrared scan and to have all these cool, hot water and soap and stainless steel and,
sure.
and cool things. And so, for example, one of the tests that we had done on our chickens was a bacteria test, and we had one done on, at the same time, same lab, same people on, a supermarket, government inspected chicken, mm-hmm. and the government chicken averaged 3,600 colony-forming units of bacteria per milliliter to the second permutation, and I don't understand that. I'm just telling you how they measure.
Okay.
and our birds averaged 133
wow.
CFU. That is a 25-fold difference in cleanliness.
That's amazing.
So clearly, we can do this in the sunshine, in the open air, but we do it much slower. We don't do it every day. Mm-hmm. We do it with careful protocols. And frankly, the pastured model on clean ground every day, we're not bringing all the manure in on the feathers, mm-hmm. And pounding it into the body through the gauntlet picker operations.
Right.
There's a whole series of things here, of industrial things, that create a climate that's conducive to pathogenicity in food.
Jeez. Well, congratulations. 25-fold. That is definitely promising. So anyone out there who's on the fence about, food safety and whether you should get an industrialized chicken or one from a real farm, I think that's pretty convincing. Yeah. It certainly is for me.
And you know what? That's not to say that there isn't a dirty backyard chicken out there.
Oh, sure.
There certainly are. There's no question that there are. But to say that inherently you need a $500,000 processing plant in order to have an edible, a safe chicken, mm-hmm. it's just nonsense.
Right. Well, we're just about out of time, but I'd love to ask you before we go, Joel, what can we do to turn everything around? What is the secret to, especially getting the next generation on board with our message?
Well, I think the most important thing that anybody can do to turn it around is, and you don't like this, but I'm going to say it anyway, is get in your kitchen.
Yeah.
The big problems with the food system is the processing and the packaging and the additives for shelf stabilization and, ultra pasteurized to get shelf life and, and all this stuff to actually make food inert instead of living. And so, get in your kitchen, get raw foods, whole foods, raw foods, get rid of the television and take that time and energy that you would spend entertaining and recreating for a year and go find, your food network in your area. Every area has wonderful artisanal producers. Go patronize them, get it raw. That way you can get it cheaper than you can processed and packaged in, a frozen pizza at Walmart. You can actually save money, and you'll rediscover the joy of the kitchen and the simple living, simple eating. And guess what? You will cut off at the knees all of the patronage of the entire, evil industrial food empire. And, at the end of the week, and I'm not saying you can't have a Snickers bar once in a while, and you can't, okay, but I'm just saying at the end of the week, when you look back at your week, which paradigm, which movement have you fed?
Yeah.
And that's all I'm saying. And if we would do that consistently, that doesn't take an act of Congress. It doesn't take a tax bill. It doesn't take a new agency. It doesn't take a bureaucracy. It's ultimate self-empowerment, creating billions of new decisions made that will manifest themselves physically 30 years down the road to the world that our children will inherit.
I love it. Very empowering, and certainly wisdom that everyone can use, and they can start today. I hope that you folks out there do. Joel, thank you so much for coming on. This has been absolutely wonderful. I'd love to have you back on anytime you're available. This is really entertaining, and you're just full of knowledge about all this stuff. So thank you so much.
Well, great. Well, thanks for having me on, and just contact me again.
Sounds great. Thanks a lot, Joel.
Thank you.